Hello and welcome to episode 55 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Bahasa, and we're experimenting with a new camera now. There was a one of you interrogators generously donated $50 to the purchase of a new video camera, partly because, or maybe entirely because, a few episodes back I went blurry partway through the video and would not unblurify no matter what I did. That is I would not undergo unblurification in accordance with the principles of unblurificationism. And so he generously donated to help me get a new camera, which is what I'm using now. But the thing is, it's not connecting to the app yet. The app where you can make adjustments and so forth. So we'll just see how I wind up looking. If I look completely funny or something, that means that it's working. So I've just made some hummingbird juice and attended to a few other things. And so I'm ready to answer questions. And we have had, it's just kind of amazing to me that we're up to number 55. I mean, if you take 55 episodes and you multiply by 30, which is about the average number of questions, I mean, you get like 6 gorillion questions. That's just off the top of my head. I didn't use a calculator for that. Um, Although it is true that some people ask the same questions that I've already answered before, which in a way is good because that means it's a question that people want to know the answer to, and it's good to repeat myself, but also it's bad because it indicates that people are not watching all of the previous Q&As before they get to this one. So I don't know what to do about that other than just berate you mercilessly. And have a sip of my sweet tea and start answering questions. And the first one is from Edelweiss Voyager. And he asked this question like more than a week ago. And for some reason, it just didn't wind up on the list. There was a glitch in my programming while compiling the list, and it just didn't work. So here it is. He's number one now. Edelweiss Voyager says, can you enlighten me on Buddhist opposition to the Vietnam War? Obviously, nonviolence is a principle that we hold, but it seems that defeating communism is important enough to put aside pacifism. Buddhists in Vietnam are now heavily surveilled. If I am being heretical here, this would be one of the hardest teachings to accept. Well, I'm really not familiar with what was going on with Buddhists during the Vietnam era. That's a bit before my time. Obviously, there was some protesting going on, like the famous Vietnamese monk who lit himself on fire. And I think the person who photographed him, instead of putting him out, got a Pulitzer Prize for that, I'm pretty sure. Um, so it seemed to me that the main protesting at that time among the Buddhists in Vietnam was not so much against the violence, but against Catholics in that were ruling the country. You know, they were like Francophile Catholics. They converted to Roman Catholicism, and they were running the country instead of Buddhists. Um, so yeah, I'm not familiar with like self-professed Buddhists in the West protesting against the Vietnam War. It was just like a hippie thing, I guess. I mean, probably some of the hippies were Buddhists, but I think it was mainly because they were hippies rather than because they were Buddhists, or maybe it was just a combination of the two. Um, but I guess the main question here is not so much historical as just the what should a good Buddhist do when communists are taking over the country or invading or whatever. And well, a monk, if you're like top level Buddhist practitioner, then yeah, you're not going to be killing people deliberately, and you should try to avoid killing them even accidentally. But lay people, you're going to have all kinds of lay people, just different levels of Buddhist, even among the Buddhist lay people, forgetting the non-Buddhist ones. You're going to have just really some that are relatively crude beginning level. You get more and more advanced ones. Some of the top advanced ones are more advanced than some of the monks. In fact, most of the Buddhist lay people would be more advanced than like the worst few monks in the Sangha. So, I mean, you're going to have people that profess Buddhism that are still willing to fight. And then you're going to have other Buddhists who are just so strict and puritanical, so to speak. Maybe puritanical has too many negative connotations, but I mean, they're just not even going to swat a fly no matter what. They'd rather die than swat a mosquito. I've met a few that were like that. There was an Australian monk I used to know who lived at Pa Auk Doya, which is very strict in its Viññāna practice as meditation centers go. And it was infested with bed bugs. And so you had exterminators going around fumigating the meditation cabins, and almost all of them, including the abbot himself, allowed it to happen. But this Australian monk, he was just fiercely defiant and would not let them kill his bed bugs because killing is wrong, especially at a Buddhist monastery and so forth. I mean, it just makes it seem more wrong anyway. So let's see. So there's just always going to be people who are willing to fight unless they just get so emasculated and decadent, which is kind of what the globalist West is shooting for, that they just can't be dangerous even if they want to, or they just can't want to or something. And yeah, I mean, a situation like that, you would think, in a way, from a Buddhist point of view, that it would be like a Buddhist utopia where nobody even dreams of committing acts of violence. But at the same time, I think Jordan Peterson was correct when he said, I mean, you should be able to be a monster and then just not be one, which means you're still strong, but you restrain yourself through moral principles and so forth, through conscience or whatever, and that's not good enough for the spiritually bankrupt left, I guess, nowadays, or just for globalists who just want everybody under control. They don't want revolting peasants. So, I mean, in a healthy, diverse society, there's going to be violent people who are willing to fight to protect their country. Preferably, they've got enough traditional values that they are patriotic and fighting to protect their country rather than just rampaging and pillaging and looting and so forth. But he says here, Edelweiss Voyager says here that it seems that defeating communism is important enough to put aside pacifism. And that reminds me of something that Neem Karoli Baba said in India back in like the late 60s or early 70s, when communism was threatening to take over India. And he was saying, there's too much dharma in India for communism to get a foothold here. And apparently he was right in that case. And really, I mean, it is a matter of karma, whether you live in a communist dictatorship or not. That, you know, it's largely your own doing. You are creating your reality, or you're creating your own virtual reality. But there are things you can do. I mean, defeating communism, you know, just peaceful non-cooperation, you know, Gandhian tactics maybe, or just leave, go somewhere else. Or, I mean, if you really think it's worth taking the hit, taking the karmic hit, you can fight to protect your country and your family and your loved ones. So if you just feel that it is your dharma in life to be a sheepdog, then who knows, maybe that's the thing to do. But, I mean, you are going to be taking a hit. You'll become a tragic hero, where you are sacrificing your own spiritual welfare for the benefit of others, to protect the innocent and the helpless and so forth. And that's not entirely blameworthy. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Saint Sword. I assume it's Saint Sword and not Saint's Word. It's all one word. And he says, he asked the same question twice. He asked it on the previous Q&A, but it was after I'd already recorded the Q&A, I think. And so he asked it again. So you get two different versions of the same question here. The older version is, what's the difference between Viññāna and Citta? The best I've come up with is that Citta is the totality of mind, while Viññāna is the reflective quality of mind bending back on itself. And then the second version of the same question is, what's the difference between the concepts of Citta and Viññāna? Is there any reason to suspect that one of them may have been a later addition and therefore a concept the Buddha never really used? The best I can tell is that Citta is the mind as a whole, from cognition to perception to everything in between, and Viññāna is the reflective mechanism of the mind bending back on itself. Viññāna would be the mind seeing itself as a separate thing from everything else. Non-duality would refer to this bending back as it's the mind subject taking itself as object, and therefore the mind is itself non-dual. And by golly, you know something? I'm going to plug in this computer before the battery starts running dead and warns me, and then I'm interrupted like half hour or an hour from now instead of me interrupting myself right now. Just a second. Let's see what happens here. This always happens. Wait a minute, here we go. Just boop this right in there. Oh yeah. So the difference between Citta and Viññāna. Well, for starters, there's a lot of overlap because Citta can be a synonym for Viññāna. Like in the Abhidhamma philosophy, you got four ultimate realities. You've got Citta, Cetasika, Rupa, and Nibbana. So here, Citta just means Viññāna. It's a synonym for consciousness. But usually Citta is rendered as mind. So it can also just mean mind in general. So it's like in a technical sense, it's the same as Viññāna, but it can also just mean mind in general. So it has like a broader, less vague, less technical sense. But like as technical words, Citta and Viññāna, they're not different things. Citta is consciousness, but it can also mean under other contexts, just like normal talk, it can just mean mind. Sometimes it's translated as heart, but that's not good. Hadaya is literally the organ that pumps blood. There are a few people that are just staunch advocates of self-view who will try to prove that the Buddha taught that there is a soul by translating Citta as soul, but it means mind, essentially. So with regard to the mind bending back on itself, I mean, that would be self-consciousness. And that's really not what Buddhism teaches. That, I mean, even a frog or a goldfish or a mosquito has consciousness. It just doesn't have self-consciousness. Or like science. You know, there are relatively few animals on this planet that have self-consciousness. They've done experiments like they'll anesthetize an animal and put a blue spot on its face, and then they'll show it a mirror. And there's only a few species that will recognize that that spot on the face of the image in the mirror is actually their own, and they'll try and rub off the spot. And even gorillas don't have that. Chimpanzees, dolphins, there's a few other, I can't remember now. I think maybe orangutans, possibly an elephant even, I'm not sure. But there's not very many. Oh, and humans. Humans are on the list too. Most humans anyway. So I'm just rambling all over the place. This is like, it's sort of like my gimmick, you know? Different people have different gimmicks. I just like ramble and digress all over the place. So I think I answered that question. So I'll just move on to Saint Sword's next question. And this is sort of a response to some wrangling back and forth, like in previous episodes of this Q&A. You know, he sometimes he would just make a comment about like arupa jhana. We've sort of been wrangling or discussing arupa jhana or the formless contemplations, and he was having some difficulty understanding what I was saying, which is understandable because I mean you have to resort to like paradox and like anyway. So anyway, he says, and there's actually two questions at the end of this. So this is legitimate questions here. Okay, let me spell this out and you can correct me if I'm still misrepresenting your position. So he's trying to understand my position first. And so the points he's got here are: one, the arupa jhanas are different sorts of nothingness, infinite space, infinite nothingness, etc. Two, nothingness is synonymous with the contents of consciousness being removed. Three, therefore, due to one and two, when the mind enters an arupa jhana, the content of consciousness is thus removed. Four, when the content of consciousness is removed, consciousness is indeterminate, or abhyakata. It's not that it exists or doesn't exist, is active or not, arises or not, it's indeterminate. Five, therefore, due to three and four, when the mind enters an arupa jhana, consciousness is indeterminate. So I should respond to these before I get to his questions. So number one, the arupa jhanas are different sorts of nothingness, infinite space, infinite nothingness, etc. Not necessarily. I wouldn't entirely agree with that. I mean, different sorts of nothingness. You might call it like different degrees of nothingness, but the whole purpose of arupa jhanas, my theory is that they don't go back to the time of the Buddha. This is like a later innovation. It was like, my theory is there's different possible explanations for arupa jhanas being added to Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist ethics after the fact, after the Buddha had already passed away and somebody else added them in. And my theory is that the arupa jhanas, like infinite consciousness, neither perception nor non-perception, like nothingness, that they were attempts at describing the enlightened mind, the mind that has attained Nibbana, full enlightenment. And that as Buddhist philosophy developed, they sort of fell out of favor. They got outcompeted by other explanations or whatever. There was like this virus-like mutation of Buddhist philosophy during hundreds of years after the time of the Buddha, and they just did not win the competition as explanations. But I mean, some of these are found in the suttas. They have like a precedent in the suttas themselves, especially like the Atthaka Vagga and the Parayana Vagga has at least three of these. You could plausibly attribute these arupa jhanas like infinite, or neither perception or non-perception, or nothingness, or the infinite consciousness one, or let's see, yeah, infinite consciousness. That's the famous verse in the Digha Nikaya and the Majjhima Nikaya talking about enlightenment, obviously, or Nibbana, obviously, as infinite formless consciousness, unmanifest, luminous all around. And so these explanations just sort of fell by the wayside. They wound up being considered unorthodox as explanations of the enlightened mind, but they were too well known to just purge them from all the suttas and so forth. And so they attributed arupa jhana status to these, which are like, they're kind of higher than fourth jhana. Fourth jhana used to be the highest level of meditation, the highest possible level of meditation. But the Indian mind is always wanting to elaborate and just outdo the absolute as it's already been explained before. And so these got added just sort of in between Nirodha Samapati, which is an even higher one, and fourth jhana, which used to be the highest but isn't anymore. And I wrote an article that is on my blog. I wrote it back around last May or so, or I posted it back around last May. That's giving my best explanation for where arupa jhanas came from. Like, for example, one little bit of evidence is the Samanya Pala Sutta, which is describing the fruits of the contemplative life. And it starts at relatively crude stuff and then works up, goes through the four jhanas. And then after the four jhanas, it starts talking about these psychic attainments that a person can get. It doesn't even mention the four arupa jhanas, the formless realms, for example. And the Buddha himself, when he died in fourth jhana. Like in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha is in his last fatal illness and he's dying. He goes into first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana, and then he goes into these arupa jhanas. And then I think he may have attained Nirodha Samapati, and then he goes back down in reverse order, back down to first jhana, if I remember correctly, and then he goes up to fourth jhana and becomes enlightened. And I think it was just too well established that he died in fourth jhana. So they had to, but they had all these newer, higher jhanas or contemplative states or just meditative states that they'd added after that. So they had him go all the way up to the top one and then have to come back down again so he could die in fourth jhana according to the well-established tradition at that time. But I'm just, this is still just point number one. I haven't gotten to the questions yet. So I'll just move on to his second statement. He's trying to understand my point of view here with regard to formless contemplations. He says nothingness is synonymous with the contents of consciousness being removed. And with regard to like nothingness in general, it just means contents of anything. I mean, there's just no content. But with regard to nothingness as like an arupa jhana or a formless contemplation, it's the perception of emptiness, which means it's not really emptiness because there is a perception there. So then he says in point number 3, therefore, due to number 1 and number 2, when the mind enters arupa jhana, the contents of consciousness is thus removed. I mean, going with orthodoxy, I mean, my opinion is that they're just sort of like an artifact that fourth jhana really was originally the highest level. And then these ones just got added later as sort of apocrypha. But according to orthodox tradition, is that there's always a perception. According to Orthodox Buddhism, consciousness always has to be consciousness of something. That you cannot have Viññāna khandha or the aggregate of consciousness without saññā khandha, which is the aggregate of perception. You cannot have one without the other. If you have perception, you have to have consciousness. And if you have consciousness, you have to have perception. This is orthodox, like Abhidhamma, the commentaries, that sort of thing. And so in formless contemplations, you've got a very sort of like a very vague, very subtle perceptual object, but it's still there. And that's why the very highest jhana is the realm of neither perception nor non-perception, because you can't get to all the way up to non-perception in a meditative state, according to Orthodox tradition. So the highest level you can get to, this neither perception nor non-perception, is, it's so subtle you can't really say if it's there or not. It's just so subtle that you really can't get a grasp on it or wrap your head around it or anything. So we'll move up to point 4 here. When the content of consciousness is removed, consciousness is indeterminate. It's not that it exists or doesn't exist or is active or not, arises or not. It's indeterminate. Well, I would say that is true. When the content of consciousness is removed, consciousness itself stops being consciousness of anything. It just starts being like pure consciousness. And because it's pure consciousness with no limiting object, it just becomes formless. And it's essentially what the Upanishads are calling, the Atman, which is Brahman. But from the Buddhist point of view, I mean, Nibbana, it's not samsaric. It's not is or isn't, or is and isn't, or neither is nor isn't. Once you get into this formless absolute, then you can't pin it down within a dualistic context of is or isn't. It's just off the scale. And consciousness, when it doesn't have a perceptual object anymore, when it doesn't have any object, it's formless. And I mean, I'm bordering on heresy here because Theravada, Orthodox Theravada, it just says you cannot have consciousness without perception. But I think if you are able to eliminate the perception, you have pure consciousness, it causes the consciousness to just become indeterminate. And then you can't say if it does or doesn't exist. You can't say that it does or doesn't, or does and doesn't, or neither does nor doesn't. It just becomes paradoxical and off the scale, just like Nibbana. And that's one reason why in at least 2 suttas, they've got this ancient fragment of a verse saying that Nibbana is essentially infinite formless consciousness. So anyway, let's see here. Saint Sword says, therefore, due to 3 and 4, when the mind enters an arupa jhana consciousness, it is indeterminate. Not because even according to Orthodox Theravada, even the arupa jhanas have perceptual content, and that like the realm of infinite nothingness or just nothingness. I mean, it's nothingness because it's not you can't have nothingness really as a perceptual object, because to perceive it, you've got to have limits to it. I mean, a perception can't just spread out in all directions, or it just becomes the same as the consciousness, and it's indeterminate itself. So, yeah, when mind enters arupa jhana, no, it does not become indeterminate, unless you're agreeing with my theory that some of these arupa jhanas, at least 3 of them, are attempts to describe the enlightened mind. And if it really is the enlightened mind, then one could argue that consciousness is indeterminate. But it's not because they're in a state of arupa jhana, it's just because the arupa jhanas were originally attempts at describing the enlightened mind that became unorthodox as the philosophy developed, and so they got relegated to this very exalted meditative state, but not enlightenment yet. So then Saint Sword says, my questions here then are, 1, this seems to violate the reverse order of paticca samuppada. When namarupa ceases, Viññāna ceases. What is the difference here? If namarupa not the same, is namarupa not the same as the contents of consciousness? Well, this is kind of a complicated, this is getting complicated. Namarupa, I mean, it's, with regard to paticca samuppada first, I also think that the 12 links, the 12 nidana theory of paticca samuppada, the Buddhist theory of everything, that it also was added later. Not paticca samuppada itself, but the 12 link theory of it, the 12 link method of describing it or explaining it. And so how early these 12 links became standardized, I don't know, because namarupa is a word, literally means name and form, that probably originally, like when the Buddha was using the term, it was pretty much synonymous for perception, like the diversifying mind, that nama is the name and rupa is the form. And in a way, it's kind of reversed. It's like papancha sankha is in the right order, but it means essentially the same as papancha sankha. Papancha, you divide the world up into parts, and then you give names to all the parts, and that's where the world comes from. And namarupa is similar to that, except it's, you got forms, you identify the form, and then you slap some kind of label on, even though the label might be just, what the hell is that? It, whatever that is, I don't know, but there's still, you're identifying something and like putting some sort of perceptual significance onto that something, including nothingness. So this, when namarupa ceases, Viññāna ceases, I mean, which definition of namarupa is it? I mean, later on, it became orthodox that namarupa means mind and matter. And then here, nama would be more like mental states, like, the perceiving mind, whereas Viññāna is sort of like the foundation of the perceiving mind. So it's hard to say when the 12 nidana links started, which was the correct interpretation of namarupa. And also, it's not necessarily a temporal sequence, that they could be simultaneous, so that if Viññāna ceases, namarupa ceases, it could be there, it's simultaneous. That's another plausible explanation, even though, again, Orthodox tradition hasn't defined it that way. So I mean, they could be saying that consciousness and mental states have to exist together. You can't have one without the other. That is the orthodox hardline position. And I'm not in total disagreement with that, because once you get rid of the mental states, the consciousness, assuming that the consciousness hasn't ceased, it just goes off the scale. It just becomes paradoxical. So you can't really say that it exists. So in a way, I'm not entirely in disagreement with this, that consciousness, in order to be recognizable as consciousness, it has to be consciousness of something. So is Namarupa not the same as the contents of consciousness? Yeah, in this context, if it is, well, the Nama part, according to Orthodox Buddhism, the Nama aspect would be the same as the contents of consciousness, whereas the Rupa would be the physical body of the fertilized zygote, the fertilized egg when life begins. So I think I've answered that. So I'll move on to the question 2 here. What is the difference between arupa jhanas and anidasana viññāna? Well, anidasana viññāna is from that archaic verse that's found in the Digha and the Majjhima, which apparently, pretty obviously, is describing Nibbana as unmanifest consciousness. Anidasana means not showing, unmanifest, Viññāna means consciousness. And the arupa jhanas, like I already said, it depends on whether you accept my theory that they're like apocrypha that were added after the time of the Buddha, or if you're like hard-nosed orthodox and you want to believe or prefer to believe that the Buddha actually taught formless realms, formless jhanas. What the difference is, if you go with my theory, then the one arupa jhana would be pretty much in the same terms as unmanifest consciousness, like the realm of infinite consciousness. Or if you prefer the orthodox explanation, which probably most Theravada Buddhists would, understandably, then anidasana viññāna, I forget what the commentary says is the meaning of anidasana viññāna. Maybe I should have looked it up. You can look it up if you've got like Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of the Majjhima Nikaya. You can look back in the notes and see what the orthodox explanation is. So anidasana viññāna, I think according to the commentarial tradition, it may be defined as maybe as a formless jhana. One of them, not all of them. But I don't remember. But you can look it up. If you have access to Bhikkhu Bodhi's Majjhima Nikaya translation, or if you have access to the commentarial tradition, you have access to like some Burmese scholar monk who can explain it to you maybe. So, I mean, yeah, it's too bad I forgot what the official commentarial definition is. It might be in that essay that I wrote with regard to the formless contemplations that's on my blog. Probably I published it back around May. And it might be in one of my books too. No, it's not. It's also on the nipapancha.org website. It's like an appendix to an article I wrote about tarot cards and Ouija boards. So just look on nipapancha.org and find the essay on tarot cards and Ouija boards, and then just scroll past that till you get to the appendix, and that's the same article, the same essay, giving my explanation of the formless realms or the formless jhanas. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here, and this is from Mikubo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. I've never seen this name before. Mikubo, I think. And he just recently became a donor on Subscribestar. So welcome, Mikubo. All hail, Mikubo. And Mikubo says, are there any Buddhist teachings that deal with the problem of exile or being confined to live in one disagreeable location? I am from the UK, which, as you are no doubt aware, is slowly undergoing a neo-Marxist cultural revolution. Curbs on freedom of speech, high crime levels, and Orwellian propaganda centered on race, gender, etc. have now become normality. Due to high levels of immigration, the native population will likely become an ethnic minority within my lifetime, and I fear the inevitable social conflict that will follow. I used to live in Japan, where the quality of life is much better in general, especially with regard to crime and personal safety, not to mention being surrounded by a much more beautiful and traditional culture that stimulates and inspires, not demoralizes. I miss living there every day. However, due to health reasons and family obligations, I am unable to return there long term. Are there any specific techniques to detach from this desire? Do you ever feel intense cravings to return to Burma, and how do you deal with them? Well, I'll answer that last one first. Do I ever feel intense cravings to return to Burma? No, no, I don't. It ran its course with me, and it may be better to be a monk in Burma. I do think if I were a monk, probably Burma would be preferable. But to be a layperson, you're better off in America than in Burma. And partly because Burma is a military dictatorship. It's blazing hot, and the people there think differently than I do. So there's always this culture barrier. Even if you learn to speak the language fluently, it's really hard to communicate at more than a superficial level because the assumptions are so different with regard to life in general. And also, like rural village people, bless their hearts, they're good people, they're virtuous people. The most virtuous people I've ever met in my life were villagers in northwestern Burma, central northwestern Burma in general. But they just don't think very much. They have like a medieval mindset. They think more like a medieval European, like peasant, than like I do. And so there's always this barrier. But I should have just said I don't really feel the intense cravings to return to Burma, and moved on to the bigger, more important question here. Are there any specific techniques to detach from this desire to be in a better place? I mean, I assume there are some parts of the UK that would be better than others, but there's one thing that you need to consider is that, like in the Buddhist time, it was a time of like psychopathic kings and just chronic warfare. In fact, there's a list of 10 dangers that, for example, there are 10 dangers that make it allowable. If any of these happens, it makes it allowable to abbreviate a formal ceremony, like the Patimokkha recitation. And number one on the list is always Rajas. It's kings. And that's not necessarily just hostile foreign kings invading with armies. I mean, it can be your own king, that he's just like conscripting people into the army, or conscripting people to build some monument, or he's just like decides to double the taxes and he's the law. And so, I mean, things have always sucked pretty much. I mean, we're living in a fortunate age where, I mean, the most we've got to complain about is cultural Marxism. I mean, cultural Marxism does suck, I agree. But at least we're not being tortured yet. We're not just being arrested in the middle of the night by the secret police and being hauled into like torture chambers, which happened like under Stalin in the USSR, happened in lots of places, probably still happens. Like in Burma, probably it's happening right now, if it's nighttime in Burma. So, I mean, again, it's our own karma, it's our own mental states that are creating our reality. And so the best we can do is maintain equanimity. I mean, if you can improve the situation, then go ahead and improve it, which might just mean moving to a place that is more, where the people there, the population, maybe a small town where the population is less politically correct or something. They take it less seriously. I mean, that's pretty much what I did by moving to South Carolina. Working in a sheet metal shop, every single guy that works there has a beard, and I wouldn't be surprised if all of them vote Republican. I assume there must be places like that in the UK. I mean, if you're living in London, I feel sorry for you. Or Birmingham. I guess the most common baby boy's name in Birmingham, Birmingham, England is Mohammed. I don't know what it is in Birmingham, Alabama. So let's see. I mean, any specific techniques to detach from this desire? I mean, the standard technique for dealing with almost any kind of like occurring like mental unease is mindfulness. Just watch it, observe the urge or observe the desire as though you're an ichthyologist observing a dead fish. You know, what's it like? How does it make me feel? Just watch it. And when you watch a desire or you watch anger or fear or worry or whatever it is, you've already made you've already detached from it. Because if you are anything, you're the one who's doing the observing, not the thing being observed. So if you can observe something, you know it's not you. And so if you observe this desire to get the hell out of this cyberpunk dystopia, then I mean, if especially if you can't get out of the cyberpunk dystopia, you just observe the desire, and then it's not you. You are observing this mental state, and already you've caused this detachment from it, and you've weakened the power of it a great deal. And it's really a powerful practice with regard to any problematic mental state that comes up. Just observe it, and just by the very fact that you're observing it, I mean, sometimes, like if it's a thought, you can't observe the thought and think the thought at the same time. It's like the same parts of your brain are responsible for both actions, and it just stops it right then and there. But if you can't get rid of it in that way, just observing it causes this philosophical detachment. It's not you anymore. It's not I want to live somewhere else. It's just you know, at its lowest form, it's, you know, I am observing this desire. And that sort of thing can also be used for certain mental disorders like OCD, the person who you know, has to wash his hands 50 or 100 times a day, or check the front door to make sure it's locked, or you know, there's all these different ways that OCD can manifest itself. And I used to know one of the world's leading authorities on OCD, and he was using mindfulness techniques like Buddhist satipatthana techniques to cure people without having to give them drugs or anything. And it's just, you observe it, you know, it's not you, it's just this OCD symptom that's coming up again and again. I mean, it was more to it than that, but that was like central to it. So, I mean, I wish you luck. I mean, it does say in the suttas it's good to live in a place that's conducive to practicing Dhamma. Like it's one of the 38 blessings in the Mahamangala Sutta. So, I mean, you should do the best you can within your limitations, within, you know, the realistic possibilities. And then, I mean, if you're still dissatisfied, then you have to start being mindful of the dissatisfaction and observing it, and just trying to cure yourself of being dissatisfied. Because ultimately, it's not outward circumstances that make us happy or unhappy. It's our own refusal to accept the outward circumstances that makes us unhappy. It doesn't matter what it is. If you accept it, it's not a problem. And it doesn't matter what it is. If you won't accept it, it's a problem. So ultimately, all suffering, all unhappiness is self-inflicted, which is the exact opposite of what like the political left is trying to spoon feed us. So you might be surrounded by people who are just absolutely convinced that all unhappiness is caused by evil Whitey, for example. But you can know better than that. And that will improve your karma, your kamma, if you prefer Pali. And the likelihood of things getting better will improve just because your mental states are improved. Because your mental states are what is essentially creating your reality. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Moo. Does a dog have Buddha nature? No, that's not the question. The question is, have you ever experimented with sorcery or witchcraft? That's kind of an interesting question. And I mean, I've never really experimented with sorcery or witchcraft, except for just a little bit. Like when I was in high school, I was sweet on this girl and I tried to do a love spell on her. But whether it worked or not, I don't know. She didn't start throwing herself at me, but I think there's a good chance if I had asked her out, she would have said yes. But I was so bashful around her because I was so impressed by her that I just never worked up the nerve to ask her out, even after like taking a note that she sent to me in class one day. And I can't remember the whole ceremony, but I remember I'm pretty sure that I cut my finger and drew a heart in my blood on the thing. I mean, I have done sort of things that could be considered sort of like love spell stuff, or just sort of magic, sympathetic magic that's love oriented. I mean, I've done stuff like that. It's of a kind of a personal nature, but I shouldn't be too explicit. But I mean, you can just do little things like that. Just just like infuse your juju into something before you give it to her. You're like, you're just like trying to fill it with love or something before giving it to her as a gift, just so that the love will like influence her feelings towards you or something. That kind of thing I've done before. But I mean, like the incantations, and you have to get the toe of frog and the eye of newt and all that stuff now. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana, who was probably teased a lot as a kid at school, says, I tried to generate some Wega urgency by watching cartel execution videos and have still not recovered. You said you had a lot more to say about the morgue. Can you please go into more detail about the whole situation, why you were there, graphic details of what you saw, etc.? Yeah, I can do that, but it would take probably at least half an hour. So I'll just have to do a separate video. Hopefully, I mean, maybe even today, but within the next 7 days, I'm pretty sure I can do a video about my trips to the morgue when I was a monk living in Burma. But yeah, like I say, I mean, in order to do it justice, it would take probably at least half an hour, and I don't think we're gonna have time for that in this video. So yeah, I'll just do a separate video of that sooner or later, preferably, sooner, probably sooner than later. So we'll just move on to Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana's next question. You say Nibbana is like Hegel's being and non-being merging. However, that sounds like Bhavata and Vibhavata. Nibbana seems like it is beyond being and non-being, Bhava and Vibhava. Like how it is beyond existence and non-existence, rejecting both rather than both being true. And in the traditional interpretation of the 12 Nidanas, which I know you don't think dates back to the Buddha, being and non-being are both links, independent origination, and only arise due to a cause. What do you think about this conceptualization? Well, first I would say I'm unaware of non-being being one of the links, independent co-arising in the 12 Nidana theory. Yeah, it's not there. You've got Bhava, which literally could be translated as existence, although according to Orthodox tradition, it means it's like your karma that you're taking into your next life, after you die. Like the force of existence, it's like that's what karma is, for the force of samsaric existence. But let's see here. I say Nibbana is like Hegel's being and non-being merging. Yeah, in a sense. Hegel. Almost every episode of this Q&A, I talk about the beginning of Hegel's logic, where he starts out his very first premise in his whole dialectic. It starts with pure being, and then the antithesis to pure being is pure non-being, and he says that they're just indistinguishable. It's not being and non-being in a way. I mean, you can't say which it is. They're both the same. But I mean, I like that idea that everything and nothing is essentially the same. Like in some quantum physics, they're saying the quantum field contains zero energy and infinite energy simultaneously. It just depends on how you do the math. Empty space contains zero energy and infinite energy, which could be backing up Hegel here in his saying that absolute being and absolute non-being are indistinguishable. But in my case, I'm not saying that the synthesis that Hegel came up with was like distinctions. You have to have like dualism in order to separate being from non-being. You have to have like perception, and that's what starts the whole universe going. It's like in the Tao Te Ching, it's like from the Tao came the one, from the one came the two, from the two came the 10,000 things. You start off with this absolute that's like nebulous. You can't even really say if it's there or not. And then It's when it starts like getting divided up, through like contrasts, that creates the 10,000 things of the samsaric world. So, um, so in a way, Nibbana, I mean, again, you can't say that it is, you can't say that it isn't, you can't say that it is and isn't, you can't say that it neither is nor isn't. It just is off the scale completely. And people trying to understand this intellectually, this is like part of the problem. You've got these intellectual people that are trying to wrap their head around this. They're trying to understand what is completely off the scale, and it's completely off the scale of like conceptual intellectual understanding. It's just, I mean, you can't touch it. The intellect cannot touch Nibbana. You can sort of give little labels to it that feel satisfying, but never is anyone ever going to really understand what Nibbana is or what God is through intellectual thinking or reading Jehovah's Witness literature or anything like that. And with regard to sounds like Bawatahna and Wibawatahna, well, Bawatahna and Wibawatahna are both kinds of craving. Tahna means craving. So Bawatahna is craving for existence, and Wibawatahna is craving for non-existence. And Nibbana is not any kind of craving. I mean, almost by definition, Nibbana has no craving involved, because craving is suffering and Nibbana is liberation from suffering. So, okay, see, any of the traditional explanation, being and non-being are both links to independent origination. Being and non-being are both links. They're like the same link in a kind of proto-dependent co-origination. Like if you read the Kalahawiwada Sutta, it's saying that existence and non-existence are both derived from this other. I haven't read the sutta in a while. It's derived from something else. It's like some mental state causes existence and non-existence to manifest in the world. So, I mean, that's a whole different ball of wax there. Let's see. What do I think about this conceptualization? I mean, what I think about conceptualizations in general is that they're never going to understand Nibbana. You just have to get to this cliff edge and just be okay with standing at a cliff edge and realizing you're never going to wrap your head around it intellectually. You just have to accept that plain fact, because you're never going to wrap your head around it intellectually. You're never going to get Nibbana conceptually. It's just not going to happen. So I'll just move on to Siovak and Sipat Zidana's next question here. The Buddhist understanding of consciousness seems like the Kantian idea that there is no special or ultimate conscious experience being any more real than another. In fact, he was probably influenced by Buddhism. We never directly touch reality, and this lines up with when the Buddha himself says, when he calls the 6 forms of consciousness as all, and the consciousness just being sensory data in a way that only arises due to a cause. However, if we say Nibbana is the one experience where it does have the property of being the ultimate truth, then doesn't that undermine the entire Buddhist understanding of consciousness? Maybe that could be a reason why tradition does not call Nibbana a kind of conscious experience, because it logically doesn't make much sense, giving the Buddha's teaching of what consciousness is. So hence, why is it closer to being the end of experience rather than experience itself, like hearing or seeing? Thoughts? Well, again, I mean, you're never going to understand Nibbana conceptually. It's just not going to happen. I'm going to drink some of this. So, we can start with Abhidhamma and just orthodox Theravada, which says that consciousness and Nibbana are 2 absolutely different things. One is not the form of the other. There are 4 ultimate realities: consciousness, mental states, physical matter, and Nibbana. So Nibbana is completely different from mind, which Orthodox Theravada has real difficulty because they're trying to do the same thing as a lot of my viewers are doing. They're trying to conceptualize Nibbana. They're trying to fit it into this system. It's on this, Nibbana is on the same list as mind and matter and mental and form. It's just on the same list. You got all the samsaric phenomena. Nibbana is just on the very same list, and it's not on the same list. It's not in the ballpark. It's off the scale. Even Orthodox Theravada, because they were so into analysis and just intellectual formalizing everything, they had to explain it. Otherwise, they'd be accused of being ignorant or something. And it just doesn't work that way. So we see Nibbana as the one experience where it does have the property of being the ultimate truth. Then doesn't that undermine the entire Buddhist understanding of consciousness? Is Theravada's attempts at describing Nibbana, I think, are really deficient in coming anywhere close to being successful, because any kind of explanation, you just can't do it. All you can do, like the Buddha himself did, if somebody wants to know what Nibbana is like, you can't explain it to them. Like, I've given this example before. Let's say some hillbilly who's been eating possum his whole life comes down and meets with you and asks you, what's vanilla taste like? I've never had vanilla before. I've never had vanilla flavored anything. I want to know what it tastes like. What does it taste like? Explain it to me. And you can stand there till you're blue in the face trying to explain what vanilla tastes like. He's going to be absolutely clueless. He'll just have this blank look on his face. He might politely kind of nod slowly every now and then, but he doesn't know. I mean, you could be a Nobel Prize winning chemist who won the Nobel Prize in studying the molecular structure of vanilla and how it interacts with the taste buds on the tongue and how the nerve impulses go to the brain, how it's processed there and everything. You could have a Nobel Prize in that. You wouldn't be able to explain what vanilla tastes like. Even that Nobel Prize winning physicist who has studied vanilla his entire life, the molecular structure of it and everything, he won't know what vanilla tastes like unless he's actually tasted vanilla. So what you have to do, if you want to know what vanilla tastes like, you got to go and get some vanilla, and that's what you should do. If someone asks you what vanilla tastes like, instead of wasting your time trying again and again to explain what vanilla tastes like, you just go get some vanilla and have them taste it, or just tell them, just go down to the store, get some vanilla extract, get some vanilla ice cream maybe. And that's what the Buddha was doing. He's not sitting there trying to explain what Nibbana is like, because it's an exercise in futility. What he does, he just tells you how to get enlightened, and then you'll know for yourself. And that's the only way to understand Nibbana. All this intellectual, isn't it a violation of this? Or, infinite consciousness. There have been attempts at describing it in certain ways, but any explanation is going to fail. Let's see here. Did I answer the question? Let's see here. The Buddhist understanding of consciousness seems like the Kantian idea that there is no special or ultimate conscious experience being any more real. Yeah, Kant was not a mystic. See, that's part of the thing with Kant. Kant was saying there's no way you can ever know the thing in itself. But there is one thing in itself that we do have access to, and that is our own thing in itself. The one that we're like a manifestation of. And that's consciousness. Pure consciousness would be the thing in itself. And it's just off the scale. To know consciousness as consciousness would be to know a thing in itself. And that's what mystics and advanced meditators are doing. At least they're trying to do it. And that's the only way you're ever going to know what Nibbana is to experience it. Or at least you can sort of get close to it. Like you get into advanced jhanic states, for example. And in the text, that's called like temporary liberation. You're getting at least some kind of idea just through what it isn't. Just everything gets so subtle that, all the things that you think maybe it is, they obviously don't apply anymore. So let's see here. However, if we say Nibbana is the one experience where you can't say it's an experience. You can't say that it's not experience. You can't say that it is and is not an experience. And you can't say that it neither is nor is not an experience. Exercise and futility. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is also from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And this one is a refreshingly easy one. You know, I do appreciate easy questions sometimes. And so he says, I just noticed that birthday cake in the thumbnail. How was it? You have really cool thumbnails in general. Well, with regard to the really cool thumbnails, I'll just thank my sweetheart for that, because she makes most of them. She makes about 80% of the thumbnails nowadays, and almost all of the Q&A thumbnails, especially lately. She's done all of them. So you have her to thank for that. She's very artistic, very aesthetic. But with regard to the cake itself, the wife of a friend of mine, who's also a friend of mine, made it for my birthday, and it was like chocolate ganache. I had never heard of ganache until I came to South Carolina and started watching Chopped, like cooking shows. And it was like chocolate ganache, very rich, with like cream cheese in the frosting, like especially in the filling part, you know, in between the layers. It was really good. Yeah, it was good. If you walked close to me while I was eating it, I probably would have like snarled you away from my food. So, okay, I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Rui. And Rui says, hello, Panyo. Are there any substantial roots in the suttas for the two truths doctrine, or is it entirely a later invention? Well, I have been told that the two truths, you know, conventional truth and ultimate truth, are not found like explicitly in the suttas. That is like a commentarial thing. But it's pretty obvious that the two truths are implied in the suttas. For example, like in the Atthaka Vagga, I can't remember exactly which sutta. I think it's one of the suttas on tactical deployment, the Viññāna suttas. It's saying there is one truth, not another, or which a wise man would argue with a wise man. So, I mean, you could adopt the idea that, you know, ultimate truth is the only real truth, because conventional truth isn't really true. It's called conventional truth, you know, samuti satcha, conventional truth, but it's not really true. It's just agreed upon as true, because we're all human. We all share the same flavor of delusion, and so we all agree. And I mean, that sort of thing is mentioned in the text. It's called Vohara Desana, where, I mean, like the enlightened monk, you know, he's got his mind in a state of enlightenment, and he doesn't believe in people walking around or trees or anything like that. You know, he doesn't believe that they're real, but still you use the language that is being used by the people around you. And like the Buddha himself, I mean, he taught that there is no self, but he's talking about himself and this person and that person. And so even though, I mean, your mind is in the absolute, you know, your mind knows ultimate reality, still, I mean, you have to function at the worldly level, which is a level of delusion, essentially. So, I mean, it is that sort of thing is mentioned. And so it is implied in the suttas, even though it didn't really get called two truths until you get to the commentarial literature. So the next question is from Joe Doe. And I don't know if Joe Doe is joking here, but Joe Doe says, was Adolf Hitler enlightened? Well, that all depends on who you talk to. For example, if you talk to Mahayana Buddhists, a lot of Mahayana Buddhists would say that we're all Buddhas. You know, we're all enlightened. We just don't notice it. Like Eckhart Tolle's first big famous book, The Power of Now, he starts off with a little story about, you know, how everyone is essentially enlightened. You know, we've all got, you know, ultimate reality. You know, we're soaking in it, and you know, there's always an awareness of it. It's just that our mind is making so much noise that it's just distracting us, and we're not paying attention. So, I mean, like a lot of Mahayana Buddhists would say, sure, Adolf Hitler was enlightened, but going with a more orthodox Theravadan approach, no, he was not enlightened. I mean, he'd get upset. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the Hitler rants videos. He'd rant about all kinds of strange stuff. And I mean, he was kind of a ranty kind of a person, and ranting is not enlightened. He would like encourage like hate. I don't know how to explain this, but he sort of like as a politician, he prospered when things weren't going well because he could like sort of get the people riled up and like righteously indignant about stuff. And he was kind of manipulating people. He told lies sometimes. I'm sorry if there's any people out there who don't think that Hitler ever told lies, but yeah, like the whole Munich agreement thing, and Sudetenland and all that. Yeah, I mean, he was not enlightened. I mean, I don't think he was as much of a sociopath as someone like Pol Pot or Joseph Stalin. I really do not think he was the evilest person in the world. Um, and there's a lot of propaganda against him, but he was not a saint. He was not a sage, in my opinion. He was he could be pretty devious at times. So let's see. I'll just I mean, he was an interesting guy. He was vegetarian. Didn't even drink caffeinated beverages like this here sweet tea. He wasn't like 100% pure evil, and I'm sure he had at least some little spark of wisdom. But yeah, he got on the wrong side of the proto globalists, I think, and also he just didn't know when to quit. So, I mean, we don't need to get into the pros and cons of Adolf Hitler. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Bodhisattva 969. And Bodhisattva 969 says, how do you think about the simile of the saw? That's just not feasible for a normal person, or was that only addressed to monks? This parable often arouses doubts in me. At first, I didn't understand because there's more than one simile of the saw. Like, one simile of the saw is with regard to anapana meditation, like meditating on your breath. How the carpenter, he's not following the saw back and forth as he's cutting the wood. He's just paying attention right at the wood where the saw is cutting. And that's good advice. I mean, there are some meditation instructors who are teaching you to follow the breath in and feel it swirling around in your lungs and your body, and then follow it back out again. And I do think that just paying attention to the sensation of the air touching your nostrils is superior to that as a method. There's less of this conceptualizing, imagining. Like a lot of them will be teaching you, follow the breath, out to your fingertips and the tips of your toes and so forth, which anyone who knows about human anatomy knows that you just can't feel that. It doesn't happen that way. So actually, Bodhisattva 969, I'm pretty sure is talking about the simile of the saw, where the Buddha is saying that even if some psychopath, probably a king or a minion of the king, is like hacking off your arms and legs, just like amputating your appendages one by one, you shouldn't have even the slightest iota of ill will towards this person. You should just accept it with as much metta and equanimity as you can manage. And yeah, that's with regard to monks mostly. I mean, you got a saintly layperson who can manage that, that's fine. But I mean, the Buddha was mainly teaching monks. I mean, Theravada Buddhism, just Buddhism originally was for renunciants. The lay people were sort of like the fans. They had their favorite team of Buddhism, but the pro athletes were the monks. That's almost all of the suttas were directed towards monks. So the Buddha himself was a monk. So yeah, the simile of the saw, it's really nice. There aren't very many people who could do it. You pretty much have to be like a perfected saint in order not to have any ill will towards people that were cutting off your hands and feet and arms and legs and nose and lips and ears and all that. Although in a previous life, there is a Jataka story, I'm pretty sure, about Kantiwadi, I think it was his name. It was the Buddha in a previous life where the parami he was perfecting in that life was Kanti, or like acceptance. And yeah, the king of Kalinga got mad at him and had his ears and his nose and his arms and legs, all his hands and feet all cut off. And he never, the Kantiwadi, the Buddha, the Bodhisattva in a previous existence, never had the slightest iota of of hatred or anger or terror or any of that. He just stayed in this state of acceptance and attained some high heaven state after he died. He wasn't enlightened yet, so he didn't stop getting reincarnated, so to speak. So yeah, it's like an ideal that you can try to live up to, but most people couldn't do it. Sort of like in the Suttas, it says a monk should have no anger, a monk should have no lust. Yeah, I mean, it sounds really good, and I mean, if you can manage that, it's fine. But most monks, even most of the very best monks, can't manage it. But still, I mean, it's true. That's the ideal. That's the best way to be if you can manage it. So I'll just move on to Bodhisattva 969's next question, which is, as a Buddhist who wants to keep the 5 silas, I really want to do it now. Are you allowed to drink non-alcoholic beer even though some non-alcoholic beer has 0.5% alcohol? I hope the answer is yes. When I was a monk, I had the opportunity to drink near beer, or whatever it's called now, non-alcoholic beer, and I kind of chickened out. I was pretty much of a stickler in my earlier few decades as a monk, and yeah, I wouldn't do it just because of the 0.5%. But I think it's a judgment call. I mean, if you've got a teacher, you could ask him, and use like if you're taking the precepts from a monk, then in order not to be on any false pretenses or anything, you could ask him about that one. But really, if it's not having any noticeable effect, then yeah, I mean, that could just be just clinging to morality and observances at that point, where you drink a non-alcoholic beer and it has no effect. I mean, you don't get even the slightest buzz from it. Then, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like there's a kind of a famous story in the Rules of Monastic Discipline about there was Rewada the Doubter. There was this monk. He was I don't know if he was one of the great disciples of the Buddha, but he's in Viññāna a few times. Rewada the Doubter, and he had lots of doubts about the rules of monastic discipline. And so he sees some people making sugar one time, and they were mixing a little bit of flour into the sugar so that it would compact into these balls. And then he's thinking, well, it's got flour in it. We can't eat that in the afternoon, because sugar is allowable for monks to eat in the afternoon if they're sick, but wheat flour is not. And because there's a small amount of wheat flour in the sugar, I mean, he was too scrupulous to eat the sugar anymore. So then it came to the attention of the Buddha, and the Buddha says, if there's so little of it that, I mean, you don't even consider it, it's just called sugar, that's good enough. So these trace amounts of non-allowable substances, if they're really not noticeable in the finished product, then it could be seen as okay. But I'm not sure. I mean, if you take precepts from a monk, you go to him and take the 5 precepts, you should take them in accordance with his definitions and not mine. But I mean, you could argue either way, I think, on that one. So the next question is from Vegan Samurai. And I should say here that Vegan Samurai has asked a total of 12 questions, which I'll let it slide this time. I don't want people to think that I'm weak, that I refuse to instill discipline in my viewers. But Vegan Samurai is relatively new to this channel, so I'll just politely request in the future, try and keep it to no more than 6 questions per episode. But fortunately, they're mostly short questions, and there's not a really large amount of questions in this episode, so I think I'll let it slide and try to answer all 12. So let's go. Let's do this, even if we do it wrong. Vegan Samurai says, is there any possibility that I can use the Pali canon to argue against interracial marriages, or at least marriages between black and white people? Or what about interreligious marriages? Well, I don't think the Pali Canon really says much about marriage at all, because it was originally intended for monks who don't get married. In fact, it's a serious offense for a Theravada Buddhist monk even to participate in a wedding. That he's got to do penance for 6 days and 6 nights. It's a serious offense. It's 1 notch below excommunication. Yeah, because like in Burma, a wedding ceremony is not performed at a temple by a priest or a monk. You just go to the village headman and sign some papers, and then after it's a done deal, then you can go to the monk and he'll bless you, and you'll get merit by offering food. Sometimes it's really cute. The newlyweds, they'll be holding hands and offering both at the same time. Like both of them are holding on to the same thing to offer to the monk and asking for his blessings and so forth. That's nice. But really, the Indian, like early Indian Buddhism, it really did not say much about marriages. And also, race is just not much of an issue. There was the acknowledgement that the so-called Aryans, the Indo-Aryans, sort of the more European, more fairer skinned people that lived in northern India at the time were tended to be of a higher social class than the dark skinned people who tended to be of like the lower castes, especially Shudras. So that's acknowledged that it was like that in ancient India, but really the Buddha was sort of a radical non-racist. He didn't believe in even class distinctions. He made a lot of fun of the caste system. And, it's just like if you get along, it's a good marriage because you're compatible and everything. I'm sure he wouldn't care. So I guess you can't really use the Pali Canon to argue against interracial marriages um, or interreligious marriages. I mean, it can cause problems, especially if you're very devout. You marry a Catholic woman. I met a few Burmese guys who married like this one guy. He married a Catholic Filipino woman, and I really didn't know about his private life, so I don't know if they were happily married or what. But probably it would help to have a woman who at least is accepting, who doesn't think you're going to burn in hell because you belong to the wrong religion or something. But that's not really mentioned much in the suttas that I'm aware of. It just kind of makes sense. So I think I'll just move on to Vegan Samurai's next question. Are monks allowed to wear sandals or slippers when they are donated? Well, there's lots of rules about sandals. And it was for many years, according to tradition, according to the text, for many years, monks had to go barefoot. And then there was this one monk, I think it might have been Sona Kurikana, who he was he was so rich and pampered that he had like downy fur on the soles of his feet because he never had to walk anywhere. The assumption being that everyone else walks around a lot, so we rub the downy fur off of the bottoms of our feet. Um, and he was like getting like really like his feet were just bloody from walking around barefoot. So the Buddha allowed him to wear sandals, and then because he allowed this one monk to wear sandals, it became allowable for all monks to wear sandals. But I mean, they have to be like pretty. I'm pretty. If I remember correctly, they have to be one layer of leather. They have to be flip flops or sandals that do not cover the toes or the heels. And there's a whole bunch of forbidden colors, like black or brown is allowable. No, black, even pure black is not allowable. So I used to, when I was a monk, for a while, I was wearing these flip flops made out of car tires that were all black, and I would just smear a little bit of white paint on them just so they wouldn't be all black because all black was forbidden. But brown, just regular leather color is okay, and they shouldn't be fancy. But and also there are rules. I mean, this is a little known fact, I think, even in a Buddhist country like Burma, but it is forbidden for a monk to wear sandals in public unless he is sick. And I assume that if it's so hot that the tarmac or the asphalt is just blistering hot, that would qualify as a legitimate reason. But for the most part, um, monks aren't even allowed to wear sandals in public. Like if you're in the forest or if you're inside the monastery, it's allowable. And I mean, if you want to study up, I mean, there's a lot of rules on what is allowable and is not allowable for sandals. But just plain, like thin leather flip flops are allowable. Or just I mean, you'd have to look up the list of forbidden colors. But mostly it's like they have to be all the same color. So you can just sort of put a splotch of discoloration on it, which the monk may not like because he may not be really strict about all these picayune little rules about flip flops. So I guess I should just move on to the next question here, because it takes me a hell of a lot longer to answer a question than it does to ask one, usually, especially because I'm digressing all the time. So, Vegan Samurai's next question: how should a Buddhist society defend itself against attackers? I asked because the Buddha said that soldiers will go to hell. Well, I kind of already answered this one in that, you're never going to have a country where everybody is a saint. There's always going to be people willing to fight. It's like human nature. And if a country ever comes along where nobody's willing to fight, that country isn't going to last very long anyway, regardless of what feminized globalists are shooting for. I mean, it's just moral decadence, really, which is kind of ironic because, I mean, if everyone were saintly or sagely and just refused to harm other living beings just out of moral backbone, let's say, I mean, the whole country might just have such good karma, like, the Mauryan Empire under Ashoka, that nobody wants to invade. They're just so in awe of the saintliness of these people. But I mean, if you got people that are just so, I mean, essentially weak, that they just like they can't bring themselves to be icky, then yeah, I mean, they lack moral backbone at that point. I mean, there's a lot of really violent people that lack moral backbone too. But I mean, if someone is just so, I mean, it's sort of like the original novel of Planet of the Apes before all the movies came out, and it was a philosophical novel about how the apes took over. And what happened was humans became so effete, so decadent, that they were not only unwilling, but just incapable of even striking out in self-defense. And so it started in Africa with like troops of apes just sort of invading villages and just taking whatever they wanted because the people were so like degenerate in their like bravery or aggressive capacity that they just let it happen and they couldn't fight back. So, I mean, there's always going to be somebody in the human race who's willing to fight, and when it gets to the point where nobody is even capable of it, then probably we're going to be replaced. So, just rely on the tragic heroes who are willing to sacrifice their own spiritual welfare for the sake of others. Or, I mean, somebody could also become a tragic hero, like I was saying earlier. But I mean, it is definitely a self-sacrifice. So let's see. Next question from Vegan Samurai. Was there a Buddhist teacher from the last century who inspired you a lot? And that's kind of an interesting question because most of the really inspiring teachers have been more or less Hindu in my life. Like, I can't think of a really inspiring Buddhist teacher from the last century. Um, I can appreciate Ajahn Chah. I read some of his books. Um, my own teacher, Pampulu Chaltsindoya Seattle. I mean, because I lived close to him, I could see his foibles and shortcomings. But I mean, I respected him. But that's not the same as inspiring me a lot. There was Mahamyain Uzodika, not the famous Ujodika at Shui Umen, but Ujodika of the Tongpulu tradition. He inspired me to some degree. There was one Texan monk who was so ascetic and so strict that he was like a Buddhist Rambo. That he wasn't really a Buddhist teacher, though. He was just a hermit. He just avoided everybody, including me some of the time. Although I could crash his solitude and he wouldn't get too upset. So I'd go hang out with him sometimes. So he was sort of like a role model for me when I was a junior monk. But you couldn't really call him a Buddhist teacher other than teaching from example, just unwittingly. But aside from that, I mean, yeah, I have not been very fortunate with regard to finding teachers that really inspire me. And like I say, I was inspired by Neem Karoli Baba, whose picture is back there, Ram Das, who is Neem Karoli Baba's disciple, Ramana Maharshi. I mean, he wasn't really my type. I prefer the rascality of Neem Karoli Baba to just the pure, pristine saintliness of Ramana Maharshi. But yeah, it's weird. It's kind of ironic, isn't it, that I really did not know of a really inspiring Buddhist teacher the whole time that I was a monk, the whole time that I've been a Buddhist, really. I kind of like Nyogen Senzaki's translations of the Zen koans, but he's kind of a crappy translator. He doesn't even try to be literal, to say exactly what is in the original Japanese or Chinese, but he gets it, and then he would be able to translate it in such a way that you could sort of get the spirit of the koan, which is more important than just the literal words anyway. So Nyogen Senzaki, maybe. I think I'll just move on to the next question here. That's kind of a weird one though, because it's kind of weird to think that as a Buddhist, I've been a Buddhist for most of my life now, and there was no real Buddhist teacher who really inspired me, other than ancient ones. The Buddha himself, for example. So I'll just move on to the next question here, also from Vegan Samurai. Can a monk give his assistant's phone number to lay people when he receives money from them, so that the lay people can give the money to the assistant and discuss with him how to help the monk with the money? Well, it's kind of, I think maybe it was just an error in grammar here when he says when he receives money from them, because a monk is not allowed to receive money, period, except under very, very limited circumstances. And then it'd be somebody else's money that he's just putting in a safe place until they come back for it, if they like drop a purse or something at the monastery. So, technically the money rules for monks are so strict that almost nobody, even the relatively strict ones, even the exemplary monks that people talk about, even they don't follow the rules correctly, because technically speaking, it is not allowable even to consent to somebody else keeping money for you if you're a monk. So it says that if somebody wants to offer you money, you're not allowed to say, okay, yeah, I'll take that. You can't hold out your hand. You can't really, you're not supposed to respond really. And then they'll say, well, do you, I'll just set it down here on the table, and then they just walk off and leave that money there for your behalf. Then, if you consent to that, if you kind of like the idea of them leaving the money, you have to tell them, don't do it, no, don't do it. You have to speak out against it. But if you don't like the idea, then you can just remain silent and it's not an offense. So, there is a long, complicated rule in the Patimokkha rules about somebody wanting to offer money to a monk for getting some new robes. Let's say the monk needs new robes and somebody says, here, I'll give you some money for some new robes. And then the monk is required to say, monks don't accept money. They do accept robes at the right time. If it's robe giving time or whatever, then the layperson will say, well, do you have an attendant? Then the monk is allowed to say who the attendant is. But for the sake of receiving money, the rules are so strict that he just cannot consent to somebody keeping money for him. So it's pretty tricky. If somebody, let's say it's like this. You're a monk. Somebody comes up to you and says, I'd like to donate this money for your behalf for anything that you need, venerable sir. Then the monk says, I don't accept money. That's what he's supposed to say. Then the layperson, if they know about the rules of monastic discipline, will say, do you have an attendant? And then you can tell them who the attendant is, and then they'll go and give the money to the attendant. That much is allowable, especially if you're kind of you have an aversion for money and don't really feel good about about people giving. Really, the only way not to break rules with regard to money, almost the only way. I'm sure there's some who can do it, but you got to just go out and live in the sticks where everybody is so poor that they can't even afford to offer you money. And I did that for a while in Burma, just go way out in some remote area where, people didn't even have the money to offer. So, yeah, you might want to read Ajahn Tanisaro's book on the Buddhist monastic code. And then, he does have some relatively lame loopholes in that book. There's all these loopholes. There's so many things that are really inconvenient for a monk. And so there's loopholes for avoiding it. In fact, there's a Burmese proverb that says, "We need that, chet that," which means if you're skillful at Wiññāna, you can kill a chicken. Because if you're skillful at the rules of monastic discipline, you know all the loopholes and the ways around the rules so that you can do whatever you want. But yeah, I mean, if you really want to help a monk, just find out who his attendant is and then just go to the attendant and give him the money and say, "This is for Venerable so and so, and if he needs anything, you know, you should give it to him." And the monk can say that if money was given to an attendant and the attendant just spent it, on his own stuff, he went to see a movie, took a girl out on a date or something, then it's the monk's duty to go to inform the layperson that the attendant just blew the money and the monk didn't get anything that he needed, that kind of a thing. But it's very tricky. It's like this razor's edge. I've read at least 3 different attempts at explaining the money rules by 3 different monks, Western monks, and essentially what they're explaining is how close can you get to handling money without actually breaking the rule. So it's very subtle and complicated. It's like a legal issue. But can a monk give? Why don't I just answer the question here? Can a monk give his assistant's phone number to lay people when he receives money from them? Well, he can't receive money from them, so that the lay people can give the money to the assistant and discuss with them how to help the monk with the money. If you do it without telling them to give the money, if you say give the money to my attendant, then no, it's the same as handling it yourself. You're not allowed to tell people what to do with money. But if they ask you who your attendant is, then you can tell them who your attendant is, even if you have your suspicions they're going to be giving him money for your behalf or some such. But you shouldn't be too happy about it. So I'll just move on to Vegan Samurai's next question here. Did the Buddha ever talk about group meditation and its benefits? I think there's mention in the suttas of monks all sitting together meditating, but I do not recall any suttas where he's specifically talking about the benefits of meditating in a group. As a general rule, the Buddha was advising monks to just go out alone into a forest, sit under a tree, and meditate. It was largely a solitary thing, even though in the suttas the Buddha is accompanied by a retinue of 500 monks. But when it comes to meditating time, they wouldn't all meditate together, unless maybe the monks were all sitting waiting for the Buddha to start delivering a discourse, and they might all be sitting there meditating just to pass the time. It's their job. Before he starts talking, some of them might continue meditating while he was talking. Yeah, but I'm unaware of any sutta specifically describing the benefits of meditating in a group. As a general rule, Buddhists were encouraged to find a place where they are alone and meditate that way. Although group meditation does have its benefits. I mean, I can vouch for that. I've meditated in like retreat settings before, and just having the moral support of everyone around you, they're all doing it too, and it makes you less likely to just get tired and get up and walk away, especially if you're the only one who gets tired and gets up and walks away. It's kind of, shames your family and your ancestors rolling in grave and that kind of thing. Or something. So, it can just sort of bruise your masculine pride or whatever. So, let's see. So I'll just move on to Vegan Samurai's next question here. Do you think it would have been easy for you to build a cult in Myanmar since the villagers there already thought you were special as a foreigner? They thought they weren't so much of the opinion that I was special just because I was a foreigner. They thought I was special mainly because I was practicing strictly, whereas most Burmese monks don't. Like, most Burmese monks handle money. They might even go around asking for money. Most Burmese monks, they smoke cigars and drink tea in the afternoon and just hang around listening to the radio. And, I remember one time I was living in a cave in a forest. It was a natural cave just in this big forest. And I had this supporter from the nearby village, this very, very nice hillbilly man who came to me, and he was just in this state of just wonder. It's like, I couldn't live like you. You don't drink tea. You don't smoke cigars. And it was like he was more impressed by me not drinking tea or smoking cigars than by the fact that I was living alone in a cave in a forest thousands of miles away from my home and family. I do drink tea nowadays though. So, but let's see, that's not even the question here. Do you think it would have been easy for you to build a cult in Myanmar? Well, the villagers thought I was special, and sometimes I would sort of jokingly compare myself to Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, except without the heads on poles. So it kind of already was a cult. There'd be women like spreading their scarves down on the ground for me to walk on and so forth. Um, wasn't as extreme as Tom Pulisiel, the founder of my tradition, where young women would actually get on their knees, line up his path, and to spread their long hair out on the ground for him to walk on. They didn't get that extreme with me. But the thing is, I couldn't really start a cult in Myanmar, even if I had wanted to, which I didn't. But the thing is, the Burmese, they are so orthodox in their Buddhism that I would have to be orthodox in my Buddhism, or they think I was just an ignorant foreigner. To the extent that I would deviate from what the suttas and the commentaries say. So far as I deviate from Abhidhamma and the Visuddhimagga, then I just would be considered ignorant, misguided, perhaps. They wouldn't want to think too badly of me, but they'd think, he's just a foreigner, and foreigners can't really understand Dhamma correctly. So it would have been easier for me to start a cult in California, where anybody can start a cult practically. But I'm just not the cult leader type. To be a cult leader, you have to be like a salesman, like a huckster. You have to be good at hype. Like these televangelists who can't just say the name Jesus in a regular tone of voice. It's got to come out like Jesus. And I just can't talk that way. I can't really, I don't want to deceive anybody, you know. So I'd have to be essentially like who I am right now in these Q&As. Maybe this is the cult, I'm gradually developing a following here, and sooner or later you're going to learn about the riddle of steel, and I might just have one or two of you walk off ledges just to show that, see, no, I'm just joking, no worries. Just an old reference to Conan the Barbarian there. And I can't turn into a giant snake either, so that makes it more difficult to start a cult. But yeah, it would be way easier to start a cult in America, like especially like California, than in Myanmar. So we'll just move on to Vegan Samurai's next question. And I said that these are short questions so I could answer all 12 of them easily, and then here I am just like Logoria. Okay, were you a materialist in your early life? And if yes, what made you believe in the supernatural? No, maybe when you're a kid, you're so naive that you're like a naive realist. You just assume that everything is the way it looks. Maybe that could be called a materialist, sort of like a dog or a chicken. They just assume that what they see is real. Um, and later, I mean, I was really into science, but still just intuitively from a very young age, from when I was a boy, I just could not believe that this is ultimate reality. Like as a teenager, I start reading Eastern philosophy, and it's saying, it's all an illusion, and I'd be going, yeah, except I really didn't even understand why. It just felt true to me, and I'm more. I got like more of a surreal kind of a mind. It's like, I'm in a dream right now. That's the way it's always kind of felt to me. Sometimes even now, like I was doing some fairly sketchy stuff on a forklift a few days ago, like picking up like really heavy beams and like maneuvering them around without smashing or destroying anything. And really, it struck me that the more dangerous it was, just the more of a kind of a dream state where it was just in this like dream-like flow where I was doing it. And yeah, so I don't know. Maybe I was a materialist when I was real young, but my father certainly was not a materialist. He is, he's telling me all these stories about past lives and witchcraft and astral traveling and all this kind of stuff, from the time that I was really small. that, yeah, I've never been really a hardcore materialist. So I'll just move on to Vegan Samurai's next question. Can you make a video with the title Pure Land Buddhism Exposed? Well, a few months ago, I did write a blog post about Pure Land Buddhism, and I never really thought about it much. I mean, I never had any interest in Pure Land Buddhism. It just seemed clearly not what the Buddha really taught. But then on the Discord server, there are at least two people, probably more than two people, who do take it seriously, who think it's like a legit kind of Buddhism. And so I've sort of been exposed to it mainly through that, because I really never sought out Pure Land Buddhism or read any Pure Land books, or I accidentally went to a Pure Land or Nichiren monastery once. That was a long time ago before I was a monk. So, I mean, if you want to know my honest opinion about Pure Land Buddhism, probably your best bet would be to check the blog and go back a few months, I guess. I should look this stuff up. But yeah, go back a few months, and it's Pure Land is in the title. But I really don't want to gratuitously offend the Pure Land Buddhists. I mean, if they're going to try and push Pure Land as legit to me, then yeah, they might get some pushback. But I mean, they want to go off and do their thing. They can be Pure Land Buddhists or gay or whatever. Satanists or whatever. And I'm not going to be trying to evangelize them or convert them or anything. So I'll just move on to Vegan Samurai's next question. How isn't even in the question here. Does a Buddhist still have to respect his parents to a high degree, even if they are horrible people? Well, I mean, if there's just nothing respectable about them, I mean, you'd pretty much have to delude yourself to like really have respect for them. But nevertheless, I mean, you do have a duty to your parents, regardless. You have filial duty. Buddhism teaches that. It says that your parents, even if you carried them around on your back for the rest of their lives, you still wouldn't repay the debt for them, creating you as you are. It's because of them that you're here, who you are, and you might have problems that you consider to be their doing or largely their doing, but still, I mean, you're not that bad of a person if you're sincerely seeking out Dharma and trying to practice Buddhism and so forth. So they must have done something right. So you have a duty, not to denigrate them, not to despise them, even if you can see clearly enough that your father's a crackhead and your mother's a prostitute, that, I mean, still, they're kind of doing the best they can under the circumstances. Like my mother, she was spiritually a child. Bless her heart, I don't want to badmouth my own mama, but I mean, she just didn't get it. I mean, she was just a complete normie, kind of like Peg Bundy on Married with Children, if you know who that was. And she did the best that she knew how. I mean, she didn't know. I mean, she and I were like on different planets about the time that I reached about the age of 13. But she did she did a conscientious job of being a good mother. And, she wasn't a bad mama. But, when you get to, the crackhead and the prostitute, at the very least, you should try to help them, and just, still love them, even if it's sort of from a distance, sending metta to them to try and like uplift them so that they can be better people, that kind of a thing. So, I mean, you have a duty to sort of look after your parents if you can, and, try to help them if you can. And if they're just so horrible that you just can't be around them without, being attacked or whatever, then just send them metta from a distance and just hope they straighten themselves out a little bit. Maybe see a little glimmer of truth before they die. So I'll just move on to Vegan Samurai's next question here. Do you believe it's reasonable to mediate? This is the most common Buddhist typo there is saying mediate instead of meditate. Do you believe it's reasonable to meditate while hearing monks chanting Om? Yeah, that'd be fine. I mean, I don't know of Buddhist monks who just chant Om over and over again. Maybe some Mahayana monks do. You might be more likely to find Vedantist monks chanting Om. But whoever it is, I mean, Om is not a bad mantra. I do own myself sometimes. And just meditating on hearing, like for example, it's like one of the main meditation techniques of Tom Pulisiata, who was the founder of my tradition, was just hearing, mindfulness of hearing. And I was told that the reason why he settled on hearing as one of his main meditation techniques was he lived in a forest and there's crickets all night. And so he would just sit there and just the sound of the crickets would just be like permeating him, and he'd just be aware of hearing, not identifying it as crickets, but just the sound, the raw data of the sound, so to speak. So I'll just move on to the vegan samurai's last question. How to deal with loneliness according to you? Well, in Buddhism, being alone is preferable, especially if you're a renunciant. Um, so with regard to loneliness, I've been lonely for friends. I've been lonely for love in my life. Um, but I think the best way to deal with it is like what I was saying earlier, the panacea in Buddhism. If you have any kind of mental state that is causing you unease, be mindful of it. Just observe it. And then that, of course, creates a detachment from, in this case, loneliness. It's no longer I am lonely. It's just, loneliness is arising. Lonely feelings, lonely mental states are arising. And then you observe those, and then it removes much of its power, and it stops reinforcing your karma, because karma is just kind of a momentum. And if you feel lonely a lot, you've got this loneliness karma that it's kind of worn a groove into your brain or something, so to speak, and it just happens again and again. And the more you kind of wallow in it, the more you reinforce it. Whereas the more you just observe it with mindfulness and don't identify with it, just you're depriving it of increased momentum, and it gradually just will fade out, or at least become much more attenuated, much weaker. So, I'm not the sort of person that really feels lonely a lot. I've been kind of a loner my whole life and preferred it that way mostly. Um, but let's see, how to deal with loneliness. Yeah, that would be the standard Buddhist way of doing it. Or, another thing you could do is find a friend or something like that. You just, join a group, and at least you'll be able to interact with people that way. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Hayet's Tig. And Hayek's Tig is a wise guy. And this question is not really that wise guy-ish of a question, but it's, what is your favorite beverage? And honestly, I don't think I have a favorite beverage. It's like different times you're in a different mood. You just eat a piece of chocolate cake, for example, or if I do, I want milk. There's some things that just go good with milk. Like after a hot day, I come home from work and it's all just hot and I'm all damp and sweaty. And cold sweet tea is hard to beat. Really, it goes down really good, like on a hot day and you're all hot and sweaty. But in Burma, I think my favorite beverage was Red Bull, which is a different formula. It looks different. It tastes different. It's just different. Like Asian Red Bull is different from American Red Bull. And back when I first started drinking it, like in the early 90s, I think it might have been illegal in the West. I heard all kinds of horror stories about how it's got nicotine in it and like steroids and some kind of amphetamine-like substance. And it was like a pharmaceutical cocktail or something. But I really liked it. And if I drank more than if I drank like 3 cans or more, I could just stay up all night and meditate. So that was about the closest to drug use that I indulged in for most of the time that I was a monk, was Red Bull drinking. Um, and it's good for keeping you from not being all sleepy, and it can enhance your meditation to some degree. But in the West, I really don't have a favorite beverage as far as I know. If I had to like choose, like you're only allowed to drink one thing for the rest of your life, that would be tough. I like coffee, with milk in it, no sugar. But you can't just drink only coffee. Maybe a good cup of coffee might be my favorite beverage, But if I had to just like settle on, I could only drink one thing for the rest of my life, it might be some sort of like watered down cranberry juice with maybe just a little bit of sugar in it to sweeten it up, so it's not as astringent, something like that. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Raphael 46. And Raphael 46 says, how do Pure Land Buddhists react when you confront them with the fact that their sutras were created much later? Well, I already mentioned that there are at least two Pure Land Buddhists, or at least two people who take Pure Land Buddhism seriously on my Discord server. And there's only one who really pushes back. He just insists that the Buddha really taught Pure Land Buddhism. And he's sort of, he wants to believe that Pure Land Buddhism is really genuine, which is understandable. I mean, if you're a Pure Land Buddhist, you want to believe that Pure Land Buddhism is genuine Buddhism, that, Gautama Buddha himself would have endorsed it. And you point out that it's not likely. I mean, he wants to believe, like the traditional Mahayana Buddhist assumption, that the Buddha taught Mahayana, but it was kept secret for hundreds of years and then resurfaced, hundreds of years later. I think the official explanation is that in the Buddhist time, despite Mahakassapa getting the Twirling Flower Sutra or discourse, I mean, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, that's fine. But I mean, that was like the first transmission of Mahayana. One time, the Buddha, instead of speaking, he just sat in front of everybody and just twirled a flower between his fingers, saying nothing. And Mahakassapa smiled because Mahakassapa got it. It was like a Mahayana Buddhist spirit trend, like a Dharma transmission or something. And he became the first patriarch, Mahakassapa or Kasyapa. But Pure Land Buddhists, they want to believe that, in the Buddhist time, the Buddha could see that people just weren't advanced enough to become bodhisattvas or to understand Mahayana. And so it was like the Mahayana texts anachronistically were put in a undersea palace guarded by dragons. And that when Nagarjuna came along, then they realized that people were wise enough to understand Mahayana, and so the dragons, the Nagas, the cobra dragons, came out of the sea with these Prajna Paramita texts and presented them to Nagarjuna. Needless to say, I mean, it's not a very plausible story to a non-Mahayana Buddhist. Even most Mahayana Buddhists, like the scholars, admit that Mahayana just didn't exist in the Buddhist time, that it developed hundreds of years later. But I mean, there's most of the people who like Pure Land Buddhism on the Discord server, they kind of consider the Discord server to be like my gig, so to speak. And, they don't push back. They just appreciate what I can say about like early Buddhism. It sort of expands their knowledge of what early Buddhism was like. They can appreciate that. There was only one person who he would push back sometimes. And so he'd be trying to explain how Mahayana Buddhism has been legit and taught by the historical Buddha, even though he doesn't have much use for the historical Buddha. He prefers like Amitabha. But, he's trying to rationalize Pure Land Buddhism being like legit Dharma, even though certain aspects of it are radically like at odds with many of the earliest teachings of Buddhism. And I don't know, it kind of got a little heated at times. And, but I mean, he's still a member of the group. He doesn't like say an awful lot lately, but he's still in the group. So, I mean, I didn't kick him out or anything. So, I mean, really the way they react is either they don't care, they just like it, it just sort of resonates with them. And so they just like it and still pray to Amitabha or whatever. Or else, they just sort of get indignant if I'm trying to suggest that Pure Land Buddhism is not real Buddhism or genuine. It doesn't genuinely represent what Buddhism was like when Gautama Buddha was alive, which is understandable. I mean, you're bad mouthing someone's religion. It's either you could be a Christian or anything. Especially if it's a faith-based belief, which Pure Land Buddhism clearly is, it seems to me. And Christianity, most Christianity also is just very faith-based. You have to believe the story that to outsiders it doesn't seem like a very plausible kind of a story. But I mean, if you say that it's not true, then of course they're going to start getting uncomfortable, and maybe if some of them will start getting a little hot under the collar and start pushing back and say that you're not right. I mean, it's just the way it is. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the Spanish Inquisition. So possibly just a representative of the Inquisition, like the Grand Inquisitor. Oh, it's probably too much to ask that the Grand Inquisitor himself would ask this question. But the Spanish Inquisition says, are right speech for monks and right speech for lay people the same? And for the most part, they're the same. Don't tell lies. Don't badmouth people behind their back because you want people to dislike them. Don't badmouth people to their face. Using abusive speech, and don't waste time with just meaningless chatter. So that's essentially what right speech is. Although for monks, there's additional, because of the rules of monastic discipline, there's additional limitations on right speech. Like a monk who, let's say, he's attained psychic powers, he's not allowed to tell lay people that he's attained psychic powers, even if it's true. If it's false and he lies about it, he's excommunicated immediately. But even if it's true, it's a pachidia offense, which is an offense requiring confession, an offense of intermediate severity. And so, there are just more limitations. A monk's not allowed to speak in private with a woman, especially if they're both sitting down, that sort of thing. Probably a monk is the amount of jokes he's allowed to tell are more limited than a layperson. But ultimately, just the basic idea of right speech is the same for anybody, for monks or lay people. But just because of the Viññāna rules, there are certain rules of monastic discipline that further restrict what a monk is allowed to say or is not allowed to say under certain circumstances. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Ludovic Balam. And Ludovic Balam says, if you had to guess, what would you imagine your current karma would lead you to as far as rebirth goes? Feel free not to answer this question because it's a bit personal. Well, I can't really say what my rebirth would be, assuming that there is such a phenomenon as rebirth, which is a convenient hypothesis for Buddhists. But I would assume that I would continue with the momentum I've got now. So probably not so different from this. I'd be open-minded to getting into a heaven realm. Maybe I'm making a lot of merit by the things that I have done, and maybe I get to go to heaven. Or if I get a human birth, probably it wouldn't be so much different from the birth I've got now. I'm pretty confident I wouldn't be reborn in hell, although some people might think differently about that. Doubt that I'd be reborn as an animal or a hungry ghost or an asura. So, yeah, chances are that each of us in our rebirth is going to be just continuing on the trajectory we're on now. So if my trajectory is in a heavenwards direction, and it's hard to say for sure, and it's going to depend a lot on my last few moments before I die, that's going to have an effect. So you can live a very pure life, and then right at the moment of death you're just cursing, and maybe you got really horrible mental states, and that's going to mess up your trajectory to some degree. Or a person who's lived a life of this evil, and then right towards the moment of death, they see the light, and they've had a change of heart, I mean, they still got all that karma that they got to deal with, but at least it's going to kind of mess with their trajectory. You know, they might wind up in a relatively good realm, but they still got lots and lots of problems. Something like that. But with regard to myself, see, here I am digressing again. Um, with regard to myself, yeah, I really can't say. I don't know. We're just gonna have to find out when we get there. But I would not be surprised if I'd be a human being again in more or less of a similar situation to the one I'm in now, or possibly a heaven realm. Um, but it's hard to say. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is the last question, by golly. And we're hitting right about 2 hours. So this is about standard, I think. And this is from Thermal Squid. And I really like that name. Thermal Squid just has like a real nice ring to it. And Thermal Squid says, would nirvana not be understood to be awareness or pure mind in a provisional sense? Seemingly, we have to use words to communicate these ideas, and attempting at spurring some experiential or private understanding is noble. So, would nirvana not be understood as to be awareness or pure mind? It wouldn't just be any kind of awareness. You know, like a dog is aware to some degree. A frog is aware of the fly in front of its, flying past. So, I mean, that wouldn't be considered nirvana, at least not in anything remotely resembling an orthodox Buddhist, especially Theravada Buddhist context. Pure mind, I mean, if you call it like perfect awareness or purified awareness, then you're going to be getting closer. Although even then, orthodox Theravada would say no, because awareness would be like consciousness, and nirvana is like qualitatively radically different from any kind of mental state, which makes it difficult to understand how you could, be aware of even having attained it. So, pure mind, yeah, that's like a standard Mahayana definition, if not of nirvana itself, then of like the Dharmakaya, which is like, the pervasive absolute, the one mind. So these kind of provisional explanations of nirvana would be more Mahayanist than Theravadan. But I am a heretical Theravadan. I really do think that in some respects, not Pure Land, but in some other respects, Theravada um, misses the boat, and in some ways Mahayana gets it more correct. Like with regard to rejecting Abhidhamma, for example, just to give an obvious example. They had a more sophisticated philosophy, some of the Mahayana philosophers, just because they came later when, like, formal logic and so forth had evolved to a higher degree than in the Buddhist time. So they're able to be more sophisticated in their philosophizing, I guess. But yeah, it depends on like who you talk to, like what religious context you are sort of dealing with. Would nirvana not be understood as awareness or pure mind in a provisional sense? Yeah, I mean, Orthodox Theravada, like Abhidhamma and the commentaries, it would have to be just a flat no. With regard to Mahayana, or in my opinion, um, I mean, just based on my own understanding of Dhamma, then I mean, arguably, you could say that nibbana would be like pure mind or pure awareness. But when you get to the absolute purity, again, it becomes paradoxical, and it just like falls off the scale. So it's like samsara cannot contain genuine purity. Once you hit genuine purity, it's not samsaric anymore. It's not in our world anymore. It's just off the scale. So, I mean, you can use it as skillful means, maybe, while acknowledging that it's just sort of a jerry-rigged attempt at just putting a label on something, or getting your head wrapped around something at least enough that you kind of feel like it's not just random noise. I don't know how to explain it. Skillful means, as Mahayana Buddhists say, The purpose of Lord Buddha's teaching is to liberate us from our thinking by means of our thinking. And yeah, just saying that nirvana is pure awareness or pure mind, perfected awareness, that would be like enlightenment. I mean, I would have no problem with saying that enlightenment is the perfection of awareness, the perfection of wisdom. But that would not be orthodox Theravada. And so I have to, specify that, I mean, I might be willing to go along with this as a kind of stopgap, for lack of anything better you can say, because you're never going to really understand Nibbana intellectually. It's just not going to happen. And I guess I'm done. I might as well be done. What the hell? Let's be done. So that's it. That's the last question. And those of you who have questions, feel free to ask away in the comments below. If you have access to my Discord server, you can ask there. If you have access to my Subscribe Star, which you're welcome to join, you can ask there. And do try to keep it to no more than 6 questions per video. And feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and look at the URL links below. And of course, be happy.